Welcome, traveler. You are listening to Ancient Dreams, where history drifts like a quiet river, carrying you through the stories of empires and lives long past. Tonight, we journey to the heart of Rome, to follow the life of one of history's most extraordinary figures, Julius Caesar. His story is filled with ambition and triumph, betrayal and legacy, yet told here in a gentle voice, so you may drift between knowledge and rest. Close your eyes, slow your breath, and let the world of ancient Rome unfold. From the streets of the Republic to the shores of the Nile, from the thunder of armies to the whispers of conspirators, the life of Caesar is before you, not to rush, not to overwhelm, but to soothe, a tale to dream upon. Welcome to the story. Welcome to the past. Welcome to Ancient Dreams. Rome, in the year 100 BCE, was a city alive with contradictions. Its marble temples gleamed in sunlight, yet its alleyways were choked with filth. Senators debated in the forum, while beggars stretched out their hands nearby. Legions conquered distant lands, yet gangs of boys fought with stones in the streets. This was the world into which Gaius Julius Caesar was born. His family traced its ancestry to the goddess Venus through Aeneas, the Trojan prince. This claim of divine descent gave them prestige, though not wealth. The Julii were of the patrician class, but their fortunes had waned. For Caesar, childhood was shaped by both noble heritage and the anxiety of limited means. Caesar's father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, served modestly as a praetor in the Roman system. His mother, Aurelia, was known for her discipline and intelligence. Ancient writers describe her as a strong figure, overseeing not only her household but also the education of her son. Roman households of this era were bustling worlds of their own. Slaves prepared meals, tutors drilled lessons, and relatives came and went. Caesar grew up hearing both the lofty tales of Troy and the more practical concerns of family debts, alliances, and survival. As a boy, he would have seen his mother at the loom, weaving garments, a sign of respectability. He would have watched his father preside over small legal disputes, learning early that authority required presence, patience, and command. Though of noble birth, Caesar was raised in the Suburra, a crowded district of Rome where wealthy houses stood near noisy taverns, workshops, and tenements. This neighborhood was not refined, it was alive with traders, butchers, and street performers. For young Caesar, this environment was formative. He saw not only senators in purple-bordered togas, but also commoners shouting in markets, actors mocking politicians on stage, and soldiers swaggering with scars of war. He grew up in a Rome of every class, learning to speak to all with ease. This ability to address both the masses and the elite would later define his political genius. From an early age, Caesar was immersed in study. Roman boys of his class were trained to serve either in politics or in war, and for both education was essential. He studied grammar, rhetoric, and literature, first under tutors at home, then under masters in Rome. The works of Homer, Sophocles, and Euripides taught him epic tales of courage and fate. The speeches of Demosthenes and Lysias gave him examples of persuasion and eloquence. From Roman tradition, he absorbed the histories of Ennius, the laws of the 12 Tables, and the orations of great men like Cato the Elder. Aurelia, his mother, insisted on discipline. Stories suggest she monitored his lessons closely, ensuring he learned not only words but also manners. Her influence gave Caesar a steadiness of character that others later remarked upon. He was ambitious, but not careless, daring, but rarely rash without purpose. In Rome, education was not simply about reading and writing. A young patrician was expected to learn the art of public speaking, for in the Republic, words were weapons. To sway a jury, or the Senate, was as decisive as winning a battle. Caesar practiced speaking before audiences, learning when to raise his voice, when to pause, and how to appeal to emotion. He was taught to gesture with restraint, to move the toga gracefully, to meet the eyes of a crowd. Rhetoric was theatre, and Caesar mastered it. Even as he studied, Rome itself was turbulent. The rivalry between Gaius Marius, his uncle by marriage, and Lucius Cornelius Sulla shook the Republic. Civil war stained the streets with blood. Marius, a champion of the populares, rose by supporting the people and reforming the army. Sulla, his rival, championed the aristocracy. Their struggle was not only political but personal, marked by hatred and vengeance. Caesar, as a boy, would have overheard heated debates at family gatherings, whispers in the forum, and gossip in the Suburra. He was growing up in a Rome where power was seized, not given, and where loyalty to family could be both a blessing and a curse. The young Caesar saw firsthand how ambition could elevate a man from obscurity to greatness, or hurl him into ruin. From Marius, he inherited the example of bold reforms and popular appeal. From Sulla, he learned the brutal truth that victory often came through fear and force. These lessons sank deep. The boy who played in the streets of the Suburra would become a man who understood that power was fragile, that alliances shifted, and that only those who dared to risk everything could shape Rome's destiny. By the time Caesar reached his teenage years, the rivalry between Marius and Sulla had erupted into open war. Rome itself became a battlefield. Soldiers loyal to one general or the other marched into the city, violating sacred laws by bringing weapons where only debate was meant to rule. Sulla triumphed. He declared himself dictator, a title not seen in Rome for generations. His rule was marked by terror. Lists of enemies of the state, proscriptions were posted publicly. Any man named could be killed with impunity, his property seized, his family ruined. The streets ran with blood as old scores were settled and fortunes stolen. For Caesar, this was not a distant story. It was his own family's danger. Caesar had married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a prominent ally of Marius. To Sulla, this was intolerable. He ordered Caesar to divorce her. Many young men in Caesar's position would have obeyed. Defiance meant ruin, exile, even death. But Caesar refused. He would not betray his wife or submit to Sulla's will. Enraged, Sulla stripped Caesar of his inheritance and priesthood. Soldiers were sent to arrest him. Caesar fled Rome, hiding among friends and allies, moving constantly to avoid capture. The young noble now lived as a fugitive. He disguised himself, crossed fields and rivers, and endured illness and exhaustion. At one point, he contracted a severe fever, perhaps malaria, and lay weak in a remote village. Yet he survived, helped by loyal companions. Several times he was caught, but through bribes or mercy he escaped execution. His fortune hung by a thread. At last family friends interceded on his behalf. They begged Sulla to show leniency. Reluctantly, the dictator agreed, but he did so with a warning. "Take him," Sulla is said to have muttered, "for in this Caesar there are many Mariuses." It was a chilling prophecy. Sulla, ruthless as he was, recognized in the youth a dangerous potential, a man who might one day overturn the Republic itself. Caesar returned to Rome, stripped of wealth, position, and security. Yet he carried with him something greater: resilience. He had faced the wrath of Rome's most feared man, and survived. This trial hardened him. It taught him that fortune favored boldness, that loyalty could withstand terror, and that defiance could define a life. The boy of the Suburra was gone. In his place stood a young man forged by hardship, ready to carve his own path. Stripped of fortune and position, Caesar sought a new beginning. Like many Romans of ambition, he turned to the army. In Asia Minor, he joined a campaign against local rebellions and quickly distinguished himself. At the siege of Mytilene, Caesar displayed remarkable courage. When Roman troops struggled against the defenders' fierce resistance, he rushed to the front, rallying his men. For his bravery, he was awarded the civic crown, a wreath of oak leaves given to those who saved the lives of fellow citizens in battle. It was one of Rome's highest honors, and Caesar won it in his 20s. For a man who had faced ruin, this was redemption. He had proven himself not just a patrician by birth, but a soldier by merit. On his return voyage across the Aegean Sea, fate tested him again. His ship was seized by Cilician pirates, infamous raiders of the Mediterranean. Caesar was captured and held for ransom. The pirates demanded 20 talents of silver. Caesar, offended by the small sum, insisted they ask for 50, declaring his worth was greater. Amused, the pirates agreed. For weeks Caesar lived among them. He treated them not as masters, but as subordinates. He recited poetry, gave speeches, even joined in games. When they failed to applaud his writings, he scolded them as ignorant. He joked, half in earnest, that he would one day return to crucify them all. The pirates laughed, but Caesar was not jesting. When the ransom was paid, and he was freed, Caesar gathered ships, pursued the pirates and captured them. True to his word, he had them executed. But in a gesture of grim mercy, he ordered their throats cut before crucifixion, sparing them prolonged agony. This episode became legendary. The young Roman who mocked his captors, then destroyed them. It revealed his mixture of charm, arrogance, and ruthless resolve. Back in Rome, Caesar turned to the art of oratory, the essential tool of a politician. He studied under masters of rhetoric, refining his style. Unlike some who shouted and gestured wildly, Caesar spoke with calm clarity. His words were sharp, his delivery controlled, his arguments persuasive. Audiences admired his balance of passion and precision. Cicero himself, the greatest orator of the age, praised Caesar's style as naked, elegant, and luminous. In speech as in war, Caesar proved himself a master of timing and persuasion. Caesar began climbing the cursus honorum, the ladder of Roman offices. He served as a military tribune, then questor, gaining experience in administration and law. His charm and generosity won him friends, while his ambition drew the attention of rivals. Though still young, he carried himself with the confidence of destiny. He dressed elegantly, perhaps too much for some conservatives, who mocked his carefully arranged hair and perfumed robes. But behind the style was substance. He was preparing himself to be more than just another senator. By the time Caesar reached his late 20s, he had already lived through exile, poverty, military distinction, piracy, and politics. He had stood up to Sulla, endured illness, and earned honor on the battlefield. Most importantly, he had learned to turn every setback into opportunity. Adversity did not break him, it shaped him. The stage was set for greater things. Ahead lay officers, alliances, debts and risks. Ahead lay Gaul, Pompey, Cleopatra, and the Rubicon. But already, in the boy from the Suburra, the man who would shake the world was visible. After his early trials, Sulla's wrath, his exile, his service in Asia, and his daring escape from pirates, Caesar returned to Rome with fresh determination. He was no longer the boy of the Suburra, but a man hardened by survival, buoyed by ambition, and driven by a sense that fortune guided him. In Rome, politics was not an abstract profession. It was blood sport, waged not only with speeches, but with bribes, mobs, alliances, and when necessary, violence. To climb the cursus honorum, the ladder of public offices, required wealth, charisma, and risk. Caesar lacked wealth, but he possessed charm in abundance. He was tall, slender, and elegant, with penetrating dark eyes and a presence that filled a room. His careful dress and manner, some said too refined for a man, drew both admiration and mockery. But when he spoke, even rivals listened. He began as a military tribune, a modest post that gave him visibility among the legions. Then he pursued the office of questor, managing finances in Spain. These early steps, while not glamorous, were essential training grounds. Caesar's weapon was his voice. In courts and assemblies, he displayed eloquence that combined logic with passion. Unlike bombastic speakers who thundered endlessly, Caesar was concise, clear, and sharp. He knew how to move a crowd by appealing to reason, pity, or anger as needed. In Rome, where juries and voters swayed with every word, this skill was gold. Cicero, already famed as the greatest orator of the Republic, praised Caesar's style as luminous and restrained. It was an art Caesar had polished since youth, and now it won him allies and admirers. In 69 BCE, Caesar's aunt Julia, the widow of Gaius Marius, died. At her funeral, Caesar delivered the eulogy. But this was more than family duty. It was political theatre. During the ceremony, he dared to display images of Marius, images banned under Sulla's regime. To the crowd, weary of oligarchs, the sight of Marius's likeness stirred deep emotion. Old veterans cheered, the poor rejoiced, and Caesar's reputation as a champion of the populares, the people's party, was cemented. The Senate, however, bristled. They saw in this young man not only boldness, but dangerous defiance. Yet Caesar had chosen his side, and the people loved him for it. In 65 BCE, Caesar was elected aedile, responsible for public games, buildings, and festivals. Many used the office quietly, conserving funds. Caesar did the opposite. He spent lavishly, far beyond his means, staging grand gladiatorial games, decorating the forum with statues, and providing entertainment that dazzled the masses. His name became known in every quarter of the city. The people hailed him as generous, while senators muttered that he was reckless. Behind the scenes, debt mounted. To pay for his spectacles, Caesar borrowed heavily, most notably from Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Crassus, eager to cultivate ambitious allies, saw in Caesar an investment. He provided funds in exchange for loyalty and influence. By the time Caesar left office, he was admired but nearly bankrupt. Yet he understood what few others did. Debt could be weaponized. The goodwill of the people was worth more than gold. His creditors might frown, but the crowds cheered, and in Rome, cheers often outweighed coin. In 63 BCE, Caesar took one of the greatest gambles of his early career. He stood for election as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. The office was ancient and sacred, holding enormous prestige and influence over religion and public life. His rivals were older, wealthier, and more experienced. Many considered Caesar's candidacy laughable. But Caesar campaigned with energy, charm, and no small measure of bribery. He borrowed more money, promising future favors to creditors and backers alike. On the day of the election, his mother Aurelia accompanied him to the forum. Ancient writers say she wept, fearing disgrace or exile if he lost. Caesar reassured her with characteristic boldness. Today you will see your son as Pontifex Maximus, or as an exile. When the votes were counted, the impossible had happened. Caesar triumphed. At only 37, He became Rome's chief priest. The victory was stunning. His enemies muttered about corruption, but the people celebrated him as a rising star. Caesar had risked everything and won. That same year, Rome trembled with scandal. Lucius Sergius Catilina, known as Catiline, was accused of plotting to overthrow the Republic. He gathered desperate men, bankrupt nobles and soldiers to his cause, promising debt cancellation and revolution. Cicero, serving as consul, exposed the plot in dramatic speeches, denouncing Catiline before the Senate. Catiline fled Rome, but his conspirators were arrested. The Senate debated their fate. Some demanded immediate execution. Others urged caution. Caesar spoke, urging imprisonment rather than death. His argument was not only legal but also moral. Execution without trial, he warned, could set a dangerous precedent. Many senators suspected Caesar sympathized with Catiline's populist promises. Cicero himself grew wary, though he later admitted Caesar's speech was eloquent and persuasive. In the end, the conspirators were executed despite his objections. The episode revealed much about Caesar, his independence, his preference for mercy, at least when politically useful, and his willingness to stand against the Senate's majority. In 61 BCE, Caesar was appointed governor of Further Spain. For him, this was both opportunity and necessity. His debts in Rome had grown so vast that he risked ruin. Only provincial command, with its chances for plunder and profit, could restore his finances. In Spain, he displayed the qualities that had already marked him in Gaul years later. He moved quickly, crushed local rebellions, and enriched himself through conquest. His soldiers admired his energy. His enemies feared his resolve. One story tells that while traveling through a small town, Caesar remarked that he would rather be first here than second in Rome. Ambition drove him ceaselessly. By the time he returned from Spain, he was wealthy enough to repay some debts, reward soldiers, and re-enter Roman politics with renewed strength. Caesar's career now stood at a crossroads. He had been quaestor, aedile, pontifex maximus, and governor. He had debts, yes, but also immense popularity. The people loved him, creditors tolerated him, and many younger nobles admired him. But his enemies in the Senate grew uneasy. They saw in him a dangerous mixture of charm, daring, and success. Some whispered that Caesar was not content to be another magistrate. He sought something greater, perhaps too great for the Republic to survive. By the late 60s BCE, Caesar had learned a lesson that would shape his career. No man rose in Rome alone. The Republic was a web of families, patrons, creditors, and clients. To climb higher, Caesar needed powerful allies. One such ally was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Crassus's fortune was legendary. Silver mines in Spain, estates bought cheaply from the proscribed under Sulla, and business ventures that reached across the empire. He had rescued Caesar from financial collapse more than once, paying creditors and guaranteeing loans. Another was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Already celebrated as Rome's most successful general, Pompey was adored by veterans but resented by the Senate. Caesar saw in Pompey not only a military hero but a potential partner. For now these alliances were loose, but Caesar was already weaving threads that would later form the first triumvirate. The next great step on the cursus honorum was the consulship, the highest regular office of the Republic. To stand for it, Caesar needed prestige, supporters, and above all, money. His debts were astronomical. Ancient sources suggest sums equivalent to tens of millions in modern terms. Creditors hounded him, some threatening legal action, others demanding repayment. Yet Caesar brushed them aside with charm and promises. To him debt was not a prison, but a lever, a risk he willingly shouldered for the chance at greater power. In public he continued to dazzle. His games and spectacles had left indelible impressions. His speeches still drew crowds. His lineage and connections reminded people of Marius's populist legacy, and his recent victories in Spain gave him the aura of a competent commander. By 60 BCE, Caesar was preparing to stand for the consulship of 59. It would be the most dangerous gamble yet, and the most rewarding if he succeeded. What made Caesar unique among Roman nobles was his ability to appeal directly to the plebs, the ordinary citizens of Rome. Where others saw only a mass of unruly voters, Caesar saw allies. He attended their gatherings, spoke in their language, and promised reforms that touched daily life, debt relief, land distribution, and limits on senatorial corruption. He knew that while senators debated in marble halls, elections were won in the noisy streets of the Subura and the crowded fields of the Campus Martius. Many in the Senate despised him for it. To them, Caesar was a dangerous demagogue, a man who courted the mob to undermine tradition. But to the people, he was a rising hope. Yet, the shadow of debt grew darker. Creditors could tolerate delay only so long. Without the consulship, Caesar risked being dragged into court, humiliated, and perhaps barred from office. With it, he would gain immunity, prestige, and access to provinces rich in plunder. Caesar gambled everything, his entire career now balanced on the election of 59 BCE. To win, he needed not only the people, but also the support of men as powerful as Pompey and Crassus. The stage was set for the alliance that would change Rome forever. In 60 BCE, Caesar's ambitions converged. He had returned from Spain wealthy enough to silence some creditors, but the debts still loomed. He had won popularity with the people, respect from soldiers, and influence in religious office as Pontifex Maximus. Now he set his sights on the consulship for the year 59 BCE. The stakes were enormous. Consuls held supreme executive authority for their term, presiding over the Senate, proposing laws, and commanding armies. For Caesar, it meant protection from prosecution and a chance to shape Rome itself. But winning the office was not simply about votes. It required deals, alliances, and sometimes outright corruption. Caesar excelled at all three. At this moment, two of Rome's most powerful men were at odds: Pompey the Great and Crassus. Pompey longed for the Senate to approve land grants for his veterans and recognition of his settlements in the East. Crassus wanted financial relief for the tax-collecting companies he backed. The Senate, jealous and obstructive, denied them both. Caesar saw opportunity. He persuaded Pompey and Crassus to set aside rivalry and join forces with him. With Pompey's soldiers, Crassus's money, and Caesar's popularity, they could dominate Rome. This informal pact became known as the First Triumvirate. Though not an official office, it was more powerful than any law. Together, they agreed. Pompey would get his settlements, Crassus his financial reforms, and Caesar his consulship. With the backing of his allies and the people, Caesar was elected consul. His colleague was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a conservative allied with the Senate. The year quickly turned into a struggle between them. Caesar proposed land reform, granting territory to Pompey's veterans and the poor. The Senate resisted, but Caesar pushed the law through the assemblies, where the people cheered. Bibulus tried to block the measure, even declaring that omens forbade legislation. He was driven from the forum by Caesar's supporters, beaten and humiliated. For the rest of the year, Bibulus stayed home, claiming to watch the skies for omens. Romans joked that it was not the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but of Julius and Caesar. Throughout his consulship, Caesar governed with daring. He defied senatorial traditions, relied on popular assemblies, and bound Pompey and Crassus to him with marriage alliances, giving his daughter Julia to Pompey as wife, and himself marrying Calpurnia, the daughter of a prominent senator. By the end of 59, Caesar had achieved everything he sought. He had satisfied his allies, secured popular support, and ensured his own future. Most importantly, he arranged for the proconsular command of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, later expanded to include Transalpine Gaul. This would give him legions, provinces, and most of all time. Years of uninterrupted power, free from prosecution, with the chance for conquest. When Caesar left Rome in 58 BCE to take command of his provinces, he was no longer just an ambitious politician. He was a man with an army, resources, and independence. The stage of Roman politics would continue without him, but his name would soon dominate, not through speeches, but through war. Ahead lay nearly a decade of conquest, the Gallic Wars, that would transform both Caesar and Rome forever. By the late 60s BCE, the Roman Republic was fraying at its edges. Senators quarreled endlessly in the Curia. Riots broke out in the streets as gangs loyal to rival politicians clashed with stones and daggers. Elections were marred by bribery, intimidation, and violence. The Republic was still vast and powerful. Its armies conquered abroad, its wealth poured in from provinces, but its institutions creaked under strain. Tradition could no longer contain ambition. Into this chaos stepped three men, whose combined influence would shake Rome: Gaius Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey, known as Magnus, had earned his fame through war. He crushed the pirates who once terrorized the Mediterranean, reorganized provinces from Asia to Judea, and defeated Mithridates, the great enemy of Rome in the east. His soldiers adored him, his reputation shone brightly, and his triumphs filled Rome with treasure. Yet despite his victories, the Senate resented him. They denied land to his veterans and delayed ratification of his eastern settlements. Pompey, the conqueror of kings, found himself humbled by old men in togas. This wounded pride festered. He needed allies who could give him what the Senate withheld. If Pompey represented military glory, Crassus embodied wealth. He was the richest man in Rome, perhaps the richest in its history. His fortune came from silver mines, real estate, and clever speculation. He purchased the property of the proscribed cheaply under Sulla, then sold it at profit. Yet riches could not buy him glory. Crassus envied Pompey's fame as a general. Though he had defeated Spartacus in the slave revolt, much of the credit had gone to Pompey, who claimed to have mopped up the war's remnants. Crassus longed for command that would match his fortune with renown. To achieve it, he too needed allies. And then there was Caesar, younger than both Pompey and Crassus, but gifted with something they lacked: the ability to bridge worlds. Caesar was popular with the masses, indebted to Crassus, and respectful enough toward Pompey to win his ear. He possessed charm, eloquence, and daring. Where Pompey was aloof and Crassus calculating, Caesar was magnetic. He recognized what neither of the others could. Divided, they would be thwarted by the Senate. United, they would be unstoppable. In 60 BCE, Caesar approached each man privately. To Pompey, he promised land for his veterans and confirmation of his eastern settlements. To Crassus, he offered financial reforms to ease the burden of tax collectors. When the three finally met, they struck a bargain. They would support each other's aims, suppress opposition, and dominate Roman politics. It was not a legal office, nor a formal institution. It was an understanding, sealed by ambition. History would call it the First Triumvirate. To bind the pact more firmly, Caesar offered a bond of family. He gave his beloved daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey. Julia was young, intelligent, and beautiful, and by all accounts Pompey grew genuinely fond of her. Their union softened tensions between the ambitious general and his younger ally. For Crassus, the connection was less personal but no less valuable. He had long supported Caesar financially, and now their fates were tied politically. Caesar needed his money, Crassus needed his influence. With these ties secured, the triumvirate was not just an agreement of convenience, it was a network of obligation, affection, and necessity. Caesar's election as consul in 59 BCE was the first great test of the triumvirate. His colleague Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus represented the Senate's conservative faction. The year quickly became a contest between Caesar's boldness and Bibulus's obstruction. Caesar pushed forward agrarian reform, distributing land to Pompey's veterans and to Rome's poor. He also secured ratification of Pompey's eastern settlements and advanced financial relief measures favorable to Crassus's interests. When Bibulus tried to block these measures, declaring that omens forbade action, Caesar's supporters drove him from the forum. Humiliated, Bibulus withdrew from public life, claiming to watch the skies for the rest of his term. The people joked it was not the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but of Julius and Caesar. In 1 year, Caesar had rewarded his allies, won the favor of the masses, and established himself as a force the Senate could not ignore. The Optimates, Rome's conservative aristocrats, were horrified. They saw Caesar's actions as a direct assault on senatorial authority. By appealing to the people and bypassing tradition, he threatened to unbalance the republic. Cato the Younger, a stern defender of old values, denounced Caesar tirelessly. Cicero, though more moderate, grew wary of his ambition, but Caesar brushed aside their protests. He had the backing of Pompey, Crassus, and the people, a triad of power stronger than senatorial outrage. Perhaps Caesar's most important achievement of 59 was securing a command for himself after his consulship. Traditionally, ex-consuls governed provinces. Caesar was granted Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, later extended to include Transalpine Gaul. This gave him not only political survival, protecting him from prosecution, but also legions, resources, and a vast frontier rich with opportunity. For the Senate, it was a temporary exile. For Caesar, it was a launchpad to greatness. Caesar's genius lay not only in legislation, but in his ability to shape public opinion. Unlike most nobles who disdained the masses, he understood their power. He mingled with ordinary Romans in the streets, spoke at their assemblies, and entertained them with lavish spectacles. He knew how to flatter, how to charm, and how to listen. Where other aristocrats offered aloof dignity, Caesar offered charisma. His games and festivals drained his purse but filled his name with glory. Gladiators fought in his honor, actors performed plays praising his lineage, and the people shouted his name as if he were already more than mortal. This closeness to the people alarmed the Senate. They feared a man who could bypass their chamber and command loyalty directly from the crowd. Cato the Younger stood as Caesar's fiercest opponent. Rigid, incorruptible, and unbending, Cato represented everything Caesar was not. He believed in strict adherence to tradition, in the supremacy of the Senate, and in resisting populist appeals. When Caesar proposed laws, Cato filibustered. When Caesar appealed to the people, Cato denounced him as a tyrant. The two men embodied the clash between old Rome and new ambition. Cicero, though not as hostile as Cato, also distrusted Caesar. As consul in 63 BCE, he had defended the Republic against Catiline's conspiracy, and he feared Caesar's sympathy for Popularia's causes. Yet Cicero also admired Caesar's eloquence, calling his style pure and brilliant. The Senate as a whole grew increasingly uneasy. Caesar was young, daring, and too willing to bend tradition. With Pompey and Crassus behind him, he was nearly untouchable. Despite its strength, the triumvirate was fragile. Pompey and Crassus were rivals, bound together only by Caesar's mediation. Pompey craved military glory and recognition, while Crassus hungered for wealth and a command of his own. Caesar alone seemed able to hold them in balance. His daughter Julia's marriage to Pompey softened tensions, and his debts to Crassus ensured cooperation. But ambition is restless, and the alliance would not last forever. For now, though, the three men controlled Rome. The Senate's protests were drowned out by Caesar's popularity, Pompey's veterans, and Crassus's gold. At the close of his consulship, Caesar prepared to leave for his provincial command in Gaul. His enemies in the Senate hoped absence would weaken him. That distance would reduce his influence, but they underestimated him. In leaving Rome, Caesar was not retreating. He was stepping onto a larger stage. In Gaul, he would find not obscurity, but opportunity, battles, triumphs, and fame beyond imagining. The triumvirate had secured his position. Now Caesar would secure his destiny. As Caesar laid down his consul's toga at the end of 59 BCE, many in the Senate breathed a sigh of relief. Surely, they thought, with his term over, his influence would wane. But Caesar had prepared too well for such a moment. His command in Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and Transalpine Gaul gave him not only provinces to govern but also 4 legions. This was more than administration, it was power. In the Republic, nothing gave a man independence like an army loyal to him personally. While his enemies whispered in Rome, Caesar crossed the Alps to take charge of his provinces. He left behind debts, rumors, and political storms, but carried with him opportunity. Back in Rome, Pompey enjoyed his marriage to Julia, Caesar's daughter. Their union, at first criticized as cynical, blossomed into genuine affection. Julia's charm softened Pompey's stern pride, and their bond helped keep the triumvirate intact. Pompey also basked in the benefits of Caesar's consulship. His veterans received land, his eastern arrangements were confirmed, and his influence remained strong. For now, he was satisfied. Crassus too had reason to be pleased. His financial interests were protected, and his alliance with Caesar gave him influence he could not achieve alone. Yet his hunger for military glory remained unfulfilled. Riches alone could not satisfy a man who lived in the shadow of Pompey's triumphs. This tension simmered beneath the surface of the triumvirate. Caesar could balance the ambitions of his partners, but only for a time. To the Senate, the triumvirate was a humiliation. 3 men, through private agreement, had bent the Republic to their will. Laws had been passed, not by debate, but by pressure and intimidation. Tradition had been ignored, offices mocked, and authority undermined. Cato fumed. Cicero lamented. But their protests could not undo what had been done. Rome, for the moment, was ruled not by the Senate, but by a pact. As Caesar assumed command in Gaul, few understood the magnitude of what was to come. To the Senate, it was a distant, restless province. To Caesar, it was a canvas on which to paint glory. For nearly a decade he would wage war there, expanding Rome's borders, amassing treasure, and forging an army devoted to him above all. These years would transform him from a skillful politician into a legend. The first triumvirate had given Caesar the opportunity. Gaul would give him the fame and power to challenge Rome itself. In 58 BCE, Caesar crossed into his provinces. On parchment, his command seemed ordinary. Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, Illyricum, along the Adriatic coast, and later Transalpine Gaul, modern southern France. These regions were not quiet backwaters, but restless frontiers. Beyond them stretched the lands Romans called Gallia Comata, long-haired Gaul, inhabited by dozens of tribes. Some farmed fertile valleys, others roamed as warriors and raiders. Their languages, customs, and gods differed, but to Rome they were all Gauls, fierce, proud, and unpredictable. For centuries, Rome had feared these peoples. Memories of the sack of Rome in 390 BCE by Gallic warriors still haunted Roman minds. Now Caesar found himself with both the authority and the excuse to march northward. Caesar did not wait long. Almost immediately, he confronted a migrating tribe, the Helvetii, from modern Switzerland. Pressed by enemies, and drawn by the promise of new lands, they sought to move westward across Roman territory. To Caesar, this was opportunity. He painted the migration as a threat to Rome's allies, justifying intervention. In truth, he saw a chance for conquest, wealth, and glory. He blocked the Helvetii at the Rhone, building massive fortifications along the river to prevent their crossing. When they sought another route, he pursued them relentlessly. At the Battle of Bibracte, Caesar's legions clashed with the migrating tribes. The fighting was brutal, lasting hours under the summer sun. In the end, Roman discipline triumphed over Gallic courage. Tens of thousands were killed or enslaved. Survivors were forced back to their homelands. Rome celebrated Caesar as protector. Caesar, more importantly, gained a victory to secure loyalty from his soldiers and prestige in Rome. Soon after, Caesar faced a new menace: the Germanic king Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine into Gaul with his warriors. Caesar portrayed Ariovistus as a tyrant threatening Rome's allies. In reality, Ariovistus was simply another ambitious warlord, but Caesar understood how to frame enemies as existential threats. At first, he tried diplomacy. When Ariovistus spoke arrogantly and refused concessions, Caesar turned to war. In a fierce battle on the plains of Alsace, the legions clashed with Germanic warriors. The Germans fought with ferocity, but Roman discipline and Caesar's leadership prevailed. Ariovistus fled across the Rhine, his forces shattered. This victory electrified Rome. Caesar had not only secured Gaul, but driven back Germans, long seen as nearly invincible. With these early victories, Caesar secured his image as Rome's defender. But he also secured something more practical: loot and loyalty. Victories brought treasure, slaves, and land for redistribution. Caesar rewarded his soldiers generously, forging bonds of loyalty that would later prove unbreakable. He also sent reports, the famous Commentarii de Bello Gallico, back to Rome. Written in clear, direct Latin, they presented him as a calm, rational leader, acting in defense of Rome. They were propaganda masterpieces, shaping public opinion. The Senate might grumble, but the people admired him. Every triumph in Gaul made him harder to challenge at home. In 57 BCE, Caesar marched north to face the Belgae, a confederation of tribes in what is now Belgium. Fierce and warlike, they were said to be the bravest of all Gauls, living closest to the Germans and hardened by constant fighting. The Belgae united against Caesar, raising an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands. Caesar responded with speed and cunning. He fortified camps, cut supply lines, and struck swiftly at scattered forces before they could fully combine. At the Battle of the Sabis River, Caesar's legions were nearly overwhelmed by a surprise attack. For a moment defeat loomed, but Caesar himself seized a shield, rushed into the fray, and rallied his men. Inspired by their commander's presence, the legions counterattacked and drove the enemy from the field. The Belgae Confederation dissolved. Some tribes surrendered, others were subdued, and Caesar's reputation for personal courage grew even greater. In 56 BCE, Caesar faced a different kind of challenge: the Veneti, a seafaring people of Brittany. They controlled the Atlantic trade routes, demanding tribute from merchants and interfering with Rome's allies. The Veneti fought not on land but on the sea. Their ships were sturdy, with thick oak hulls and leather sails, built to withstand Atlantic storms. Roman galleys, light and swift, were ill-suited for such conditions. Caesar improvised. He ordered hooks and scythes mounted on long poles, used to tear down the enemy's rigging. At the Battle of Morbihan Gulf, Roman sailors slashed through the Veneti's sails, leaving their ships helpless. The fleet was destroyed, and the Veneti surrendered. Caesar punished them harshly. Their leaders were executed, their people sold into slavery. It was a brutal lesson to all Gauls. Defiance would bring ruin. By 55 BCE, Caesar's ambition reached beyond Gaul. He looked across the Channel to the misty island of Britannia, known to Romans only by rumor and trade. Conquering it would bring immense prestige, for no Roman general had ventured so far. With a fleet assembled, Caesar crossed into Britain. The landing was perilous. Britons gathered on the cliffs, hurling spears and stones. Roman soldiers, burdened with armor, leapt into the surf and waded ashore under fire. At first they struggled, but standard-bearers, refusing to retreat, plunged into the waves, rallying their comrades. The legions established a foothold, fought skirmishes inland, and forced several tribes to submit. Yet the expedition was brief. Lacking supplies and threatened by storms, Caesar soon withdrew. Though no conquest was secured, the invasion thrilled Rome. Caesar had dared what none before him had attempted. Back in Rome, Caesar's reports of these campaigns circulated widely. They described not reckless conquest, but orderly defense of allies and punishment of treachery. Written in clear prose, they made him appear as a rational guardian of Rome, not an ambitious conqueror. In reality, Caesar was securing not only territory, but also his own legend. Every victory, every daring exploit, from the Sabis River to the shores of Britain, added to his aura. The Senate grew restless. His enemies muttered that he sought monarchy, but the people admired him more with every report. In 54 BCE, Caesar returned to Britain with greater preparation. This time, he brought a larger fleet, more cavalry, and plans for deeper conquest. The Britons, led by tribal kings such as Cassivellaunus, resisted fiercely. They employed chariots, a style of warfare strange to Roman eyes. Lightly armed warriors leapt from the chariots to fight, then remounted to retreat or strike again. The speed and mobility of this tactic frustrated the disciplined legions. Caesar adapted. He countered with tight formations, steady advances, and fortifications. Battles were fierce but inconclusive. Eventually, Cassivellaunus sued for peace, agreeing to tribute and hostages. Again, Caesar soon withdrew. Storms battered his fleet, and unrest in Gaul demanded his return. Yet even without permanent conquest, the expeditions dazzled Rome. Caesar had carried Roman arms beyond the known world, planting the eagle standards on distant shores. That same year, Caesar staged another feat of daring, the crossing of the Rhine River. Germanic tribes had long raided Gaul, retreating across the river when threatened. Rather than pursue them timidly, Caesar ordered the construction of a bridge. In just 10 days, Roman engineers built a massive timber structure spanning the Rhine, a marvel of skill and speed. The legions marched across, ravaging hostile lands and demonstrating that no natural barrier could protect Rome's enemies. After 18 days, Caesar withdrew and dismantled the bridge. The message was clear: Rome could reach anywhere, even across rivers that seemed impassable. The feat astonished allies and terrified foes. While Caesar sought glory abroad, unrest smoldered in Gaul. Heavy tribute, conscription, and harsh punishments bred resentment. Some tribes whispered of revolt, waiting for the right moment to strike. In 54 BCE, the death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, weakened the bond between the triumvirs. Around the same time, Crassus embarked on his ill-fated campaign against Parthia, leaving the alliance strained. Caesar's political position in Rome grew more fragile, making his successes in Gaul even more vital. Then came disaster. The Eburones, under their leader Ambiorix, ambushed Roman legions wintering in northern Gaul. Entire cohorts were annihilated, their commanders killed. It was one of the worst defeats Caesar had suffered. Furious, Caesar launched brutal reprisals. He burned villages, destroyed crops, and enslaved survivors. Mercy gave way to terror. Gaul was reminded that resistance carried a terrible price. Despite setbacks, Caesar steadily expanded Roman control. Fortresses, roads, and garrisons spread across Gaul. His legions grew more experienced, more loyal, and more dependent on him personally. He spent winters writing his commentaries, shaping not only the story of war but his own image. To Romans, he appeared as a calm narrator, reporting facts without vanity. In truth, every line was propaganda, defending his actions and magnifying his achievements. By 53 BCE, Caesar had secured much of Gaul, yet resistance was not extinguished. A greater revolt loomed, one that would test Caesar as never before. In 52 BCE, the simmering resentment of the Gallic tribes erupted into open rebellion. At its head rose a young Arvernian noble, Vercingetorix, charismatic, cunning, and ruthless. He united tribes that had long feuded with one another. For the first time, Gaul stood together against Rome. Vercingetorix understood Caesar's strengths. Rather than risk pitched battles, he waged a war of attrition. He ordered villages burned, crops destroyed, and supplies denied to the Romans. His goal was to starve Caesar's legions, forcing them to retreat. This scorched earth policy horrified his own people, but his authority was absolute. Better to burn one's home than let Romans feast on it, he declared. At Gergovia, Vercingetorix scored a stunning victory. Caesar, attempting to take the fortified town, suffered heavy losses. The Gauls rejoiced. Rome was not invincible. The defeat shook Caesar, but it did not break him. He withdrew strategically, regrouped, and prepared for a decisive confrontation. Later that year, Vercingetorix withdrew to the hilltop fortress of Alasia, in modern Burgundy. Surrounded by walls and warriors, he believed the stronghold impregnable. Caesar chose not to storm it directly. Instead, he encircled the fortress with a ring of fortifications, trenches, walls, and towers stretching for miles. When word came that a massive Gallic relief army was approaching, Caesar built a second line of defenses facing outward. It was a masterpiece of engineering. The Romans trapped their enemy inside while preparing to fight attackers outside. Caesar and his men were in the middle, besieged and besieging at once. The relief army struck with ferocity. Waves of Gauls hurled themselves against Roman lines. Inside Alasia, Vercingetorix's men attacked simultaneously. Caesar's legions fought day and night, weary but unyielding. At the crisis point, Caesar donned his scarlet cloak and rode along the lines. His presence reignited his soldiers' spirit. In a climactic assault, the Romans broke the relief army, driving it into rout. Vercingetorix, realizing the cause was lost, surrendered. Proudly, he rode out, cast his weapons at Caesar's feet, and offered himself to fate. The fall of Alasia crushed the Gallic revolt. Though skirmishes continued, organized resistance was broken. Gaul became a Roman province, its tribes subdued, its wealth flowing to Rome. For Caesar, the victory was total. He had conquered a vast land, enriched himself beyond measure, and secured the undying loyalty of his legions. In Rome his fame towered above all rivals, but success bred fear. Senators whispered that he had become too powerful, too beloved by soldiers, too dangerous to the Republic. Caesar's conquest of Gaul changed Europe forever. Roman roads, cities, and culture spread across the land. The Gallic tribes, once proud and free, were woven into Rome's empire. For Caesar, the wars provided more than glory. They gave him a veteran army, bound to him personally. That loyalty would soon be tested when he turned from foreign enemies to rivals within Rome itself. The Gallic wars were over. The civil wars were about to begin. By 50 BCE, Caesar stood at the peak of his power. For nearly a decade, he had ruled Gaul with sword and pen. His commentaries made him a household name in Rome, celebrated as both general and author. His soldiers adored him, his enemies feared him, and his popularity soared. But Rome itself was uneasy. Senators muttered that Caesar had grown too great, his ambition too obvious. They feared his return would mean domination of the Republic. Laws limited a consul's term. Tradition demanded generals disband their armies before entering Rome. But Caesar knew too well. Without his legions he would be vulnerable. He had made countless enemies, among them Cato, who despised his populism, and Cicero, who distrusted his ambition. Even Pompey, once his ally and son-in-law, grew distant after Julius' death and Crassus's fall in Parthia. Rome was no longer bound by the triumvirate. Pompey commanded the loyalty of the Senate and much of the Republic. Caesar commanded Gaul and his legions. A clash was inevitable. In 50 BCE, the Senate, swayed by Pompey and the Optimates, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They argued that his term was finished, that his command could not continue indefinitely. Caesar countered with offers of compromise. He proposed to lay down his arms if Pompey did the same, but Pompey refused, and the Senate rejected the proposal. On January 7, 49 BCE, the Senate declared Caesar an enemy of the state if he did not comply. Dictatorial powers were granted to Pompey to defend the Republic. The message was clear: surrender or be destroyed. At Ravenna, on the northern edge of Italy, Caesar considered his choice. To obey the Senate meant ruin, prosecution, exile, perhaps death. To resist meant civil war. On the night of January 10, 49 BCE, he made his decision. Leading the 13th Legion, he marched south and reached the small river Rubicon, the boundary between his province and Italy proper. To cross it with an army was treason. To hesitate was to lose everything. Ancient writers record him pausing, uncertain, before declaring, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. With those words, Caesar stepped into history. The Rubicon was crossed, and the Republic was plunged into civil war. Panic seized Rome. The Senate and Pompey had not expected Caesar to act with such speed. While they scrambled to muster forces, Caesar advanced relentlessly, capturing towns without resistance. Pompey, unprepared to defend the city, withdrew to the south, gathering allies in Greece. Senators, nobles, and supporters followed him, believing the East would provide vast resources and loyal legions. Caesar entered Rome unopposed. He seized the treasury, calmed the citizens, and presented himself not as conqueror, but as restorer of order. Yet he knew the real fight lay ahead, across the sea, where Pompey was assembling the might of the Republic. Once the Rubicon was crossed, Caesar wasted no time. His genius in war lay not only in battle but in speed. With only one legion at first, he advanced so quickly that towns surrendered without resistance. Garrisons opened their gates, and ordinary Italians welcomed him rather than resist. He sent messages proclaiming mercy to those who submitted. No proscriptions, no mass executions. Unlike Sulla, he promised clemency. This policy disarmed many of his enemies, making resistance seem both dangerous and unnecessary. Within weeks, much of Italy was in his hands. Pompey had boasted he could raise legions simply by stamping his foot. In reality, he was unprepared. Caesar's advance forced him into retreat. He evacuated Rome with many senators, heading to Brundisium, the great port in the south. From there he sailed to Greece to gather forces. For Caesar, this was a mixed blessing. Rome itself lay open, but the enemy escaped. To pursue across the sea immediately was impossible without a fleet. Instead, he turned westward to eliminate Pompey's allies in Spain. Spain was crucial. There, Pompey's legates commanded experienced legions. If left unchecked, they could threaten Caesar's position in Italy. In a brilliant campaign, Caesar marched across the Pyrenees, surprising his enemies with speed. At Ilerda in 49 BCE, he faced Pompeian forces entrenched in strong positions. Floods and supply shortages threatened his army, but Caesar's discipline and engineering saved the day. Through maneuver and negotiation rather than slaughter, he forced the enemy to surrender. By conquering Spain without a major pitched battle, Caesar secured his rear and added more legions to his cause. With Spain pacified, Caesar returned briefly to Rome. He arranged for elections, confirmed his authority, and prepared for the decisive confrontation with Pompey. But he also displayed moderation. He invited exiled senators to return, restored order in the city, and continued to emphasize clemency. His message was simple. He was not waging war on Rome, but on those who had driven him unjustly from power. The people believed him. The Senate, however, remained divided. Many still saw him as a tyrant in the making. By 48 BCE, the time had come. Caesar assembled a fleet and prepared to cross into Greece. Pompey awaited him with a far larger army. Supplied by the wealth of the East and supported by much of the Senate, the stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the Republic. In early 48 BCE, Caesar crossed the Adriatic with part of his army. Storms scattered his fleet, leaving him with only a fraction of his legions on hostile soil. Pompey, meanwhile, commanded a larger force supplied by the wealth of the East and backed by the Senate. For months Caesar maneuvered cautiously, avoiding pitched battle while waiting for reinforcements. His soldiers endured hunger, cold, and uncertainty, yet their loyalty held firm. Caesar's presence among them, sharing their hardships, strengthened their devotion. Pompey established a fortified camp at Dyrrhachium, on the coast of modern Albania. Caesar attempted to besiege him, constructing lines of fortifications stretching for miles, a daring attempt to trap a larger army. But Pompey broke through. In a sudden assault, his forces smashed part of Caesar's lines, nearly routing the legions. For a moment, Caesar faced disaster. Only discipline and his personal leadership saved the army from annihilation. He withdrew in good order, admitting later that this was the closest he had come to true defeat. Pompey's soldiers celebrated, believing victory assured. Yet Caesar refused to despair. He reminded his men that battles were not decided by one setback. He marched inland, drawing Pompey away from his secure base and stretching his supply lines. Despite hunger and exhaustion, his legions followed. They trusted Caesar's judgment, knowing he often turned crisis into triumph. Pompey, urged by senators to finish the war, pursued him. Confident in superior numbers, he prepared to deliver the final blow. In the plains of Thessaly, near the town of Phaselis, the two armies at last faced each other. Pompey commanded nearly twice as many soldiers, supported by cavalry from the east. Caesar's army was smaller, but hardened by years of war in Gaul, and bound to him by unbreakable loyalty. The outcome would decide not only who ruled Rome, but whether the Republic itself would endure or be transformed forever. On August 9, 48 BCE, the armies of Caesar and Pompey faced one another on the dusty plain of Pharsalus in Thessaly. Pompey commanded nearly 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, supported by senators and nobles who expected to watch Caesar's destruction. Caesar had only 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, yet his veterans were hardened by a decade of campaigns in Gaul. Pompey planned to use his superior cavalry to envelop Caesar's right flank and crush him. Caesar anticipated this. He concealed a reserve of infantry behind his lines, instructing them to thrust not at the enemy horses, but at the riders' faces. The battle began with a clash of infantry. Pompey's cavalry surged forward, overwhelming Caesar's smaller mounted force. But as they pressed in, Caesar's hidden reserves charged. Blades and javelins flashed, striking at unprotected faces. Horses panicked, riders broke ranks, and Pompey's cavalry fled in confusion. With the flanks secured, Caesar ordered a general advance. His veterans pushed relentlessly, breaking Pompey's lines. Panic spread through the Optimates' camp. Senators who had expected to feast on Caesar's downfall fled in terror. By day's end, Pompey's grand army was shattered. Tens of thousands surrendered. Caesar, as promised, spared many, continuing his policy of clemency. Pompey himself escaped the field. Casting aside his dignity, he fled first to Larissa, then to the coast. There, with a few loyal followers, he boarded a ship bound for Egypt, hoping to find refuge with the young King Ptolemy XIII. But fate was cruel. In Alexandria, Pompey was betrayed. On September 28, 48 BCE, as he stepped ashore, assassins sent by the Egyptian court struck him down. The head of Rome's greatest general was presented to Caesar as a gift. When Caesar saw it, he wept. Pompey had once been his ally, his son-in-law, and the greatest man of Rome. His fall was a grim reminder of fortune's cruelty. With Pharsalus, Caesar had achieved what seemed impossible. He, the underdog, had defeated Pompey, the Senate, and the Optimates. The Republic now lay at his feet. Yet victory brought new challenges. The civil war was not over. Pompey's followers still resisted, and the East beckoned Caesar into new intrigues, none more famous than his encounter with Cleopatra in Egypt. The Rubicon had led to Pharsalus. Pharsalus would lead to Alexandria, Africa, and Spain. Caesar's march was far from finished. The dust of Phasaeluses had barely settled when Caesar faced a new dilemma. Pompey was defeated, but not destroyed. His allies remained scattered across the Mediterranean. The Senate's most powerful families still lived, and Pompey himself had fled east. Caesar could not rest. If he allowed his enemies time to regroup, the war would continue indefinitely. He needed to strike swiftly, to cut off Pompey before he could raise another army. Thus began Caesar's pursuit across the seas, a chase that would lead not only to the death of his rival, but also into the heart of Egypt's royal intrigues. Pompey arrived in Egypt in September 48 BCE, seeking refuge with the young king Ptolemy XIII. Egypt was wealthy, but unstable. Ptolemy ruled with his sister Cleopatra VII, though their relationship was poisoned by rivalry and civil war. The Egyptian ministers, fearful of Caesar's wrath, decided to betray Pompey rather than shelter him. On September 28, as Pompey stepped from his boat to the shore, he was stabbed and beheaded. His killers presented his head to Caesar as a gesture of loyalty, but Caesar was horrified. When the severed head of Pompey was brought to him, he turned away and wept. Pompey had once been his ally, even his family through marriage to Julia. To see him struck down in exile, dishonored by foreigners, was a bitter end. Rather than celebrate, Caesar mourned. He ordered Pompey's body retrieved from the shore and given proper burial. Even in victory, he showed the clemency and dignity that defined his approach to rivals. Caesar entered Alexandria soon after. Egypt was in turmoil. The teenage king Ptolemy XIII and his advisors sought to maintain control, while Cleopatra, exiled and maneuvering for power, plotted her return. Caesar, though still in pursuit of Pompey's allies, suddenly found himself entangled in Egyptian politics. For him, it was both a danger and an opportunity. Egypt was rich, its grain vital to Rome. Whoever ruled Alexandria would be a powerful ally or enemy. And in Cleopatra, Caesar found not only a political partner, but a companion whose allure would echo through history. Cleopatra was 21 when she sought Caesar's aid. Exiled from Alexandria by her brother's advisors, she knew that only Roman support could restore her throne. Bold and cunning, she found a way into Caesar's presence that would become legend. According to ancient accounts, she had herself smuggled into the royal palace rolled in a carpet, or perhaps in a sack of linen, and presented to Caesar. When the cloth was unrolled, the young queen emerged, radiant, charismatic, and utterly fearless. Caesar, 52 at the time, was captivated. Cleopatra's beauty was matched by wit and ambition. She spoke several languages, understood politics intimately, and radiated confidence. For Caesar, weary from war, she was a spark of intrigue and charm. Their meeting sealed an alliance. Cleopatra would support Caesar, and Caesar would restore her to the throne. Ptolemy's advisors, outraged at Caesar's interference and Cleopatra's return, raised resistance. Alexandria erupted in violence. Riots filled the streets, and the royal palace became a fortress. Thus began the Alexandrian War, a strange campaign fought not across open fields but within the crowded, chaotic streets of the city. Caesar and his small Roman force found themselves besieged by the Egyptians, outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements. For months, fighting raged through the harbor and alleys. Ships burned, towers collapsed, and the great library of Alexandria may have suffered damage in the chaos. Caesar himself narrowly escaped death more than once, diving into the harbor to swim away from danger during one assault. The war hung in the balance until reinforcements arrived. Legions loyal to Caesar, led by allies from Asia Minor and Syria. With their aid, Caesar broke the siege. In 47 BCE, Ptolemy XIII's forces were defeated on the Nile. The young king is said to have drowned in the river during the rout. Cleopatra, with Caesar's support, was restored as queen, ruling jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, though she was the true power. Their alliance deepened into intimacy. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy XV, Philopator Caesar, better known as Caesarion. Though Rome never officially recognized him, Cleopatra promoted him as Caesar's heir. Caesar lingered in Egypt for months after the war, enchanted by Cleopatra's company, and fascinated by the wealth and grandeur of the Nile kingdom. His enemies in Rome whispered that he had become a slave to the queen, but eventually, duty called. The Republic was still divided. Pompey's allies remained at large, and new campaigns awaited. Even after Pompey's death and the Alexandrian War, Caesar's enemies were not defeated. In Asia Minor, Pharnaces II, the son of Mithridates the Great, had seized the chance to rebel. He crushed a Roman army at Zela, threatening to undo years of Roman victories in the east. Caesar could not ignore this challenge. Leaving Cleopatra behind in Egypt, he marched north with astonishing speed. His veterans, though weary from years of campaigning, followed without hesitation. At Zela, in 47 BCE, Caesar met Pharnaces in battle. The fight was brief and decisive. Within hours, the enemy army was routed, and Pharnaces fled. Caesar summed it up in 3 words that became immortal: Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The phrase captured not only the swiftness of the campaign, but the essence of Caesar's genius: speed, clarity, and finality. Caesar returned to Rome briefly in late 47 BCE. He needed to restore order, pay debts, and assert control over the government. But he found the city restless. The Senate was divided, his enemies whispered of tyranny, and even his allies grew uneasy at his growing dominance. Riots broke out over debt relief, grain shortages, and political rivalries. Caesar, however, remained calm. He appointed officials, passed reforms, and prepared for the next stage of war. For though Pompey was gone, his supporters still held Africa, commanding powerful legions and awaiting their chance to strike back. In North Africa, a formidable coalition had gathered. Metellus Scipio, Cato the Younger, and Labienus, once Caesar's trusted lieutenant, now commanded Pompeian forces. They allied with King Juba I of Numidia, bringing elephants and local troops to their side. For Caesar, this was a dangerous threat. These men had experience, wealth, and a cause: vengeance for Pompey and defense of the Republic. If Africa remained in their hands, the war would never end. In late 47 BCE, Caesar set sail once more, determined to finish the struggle once and for all. In early 46 BCE, Caesar landed in Africa to confront the Pompeian coalition. His veterans, though weary, were determined. Against them stood Scipio, Cato, Labienus, and King Juba with his Numidian army and war elephants. The decisive clash came at Thapsus. Caesar arrayed his legions with calm precision. When the Numidian elephants charged, his soldiers met them with missiles, noise, and specially trained troops who struck at the beasts' vulnerable points. Panic spread among the animals, who trampled their own allies. With the elephants broken, Caesar's legions surged forward. Scipio's army collapsed. Tens of thousands were slain or captured. The Pompeian cause in Africa was shattered. Not all submitted. Cato the Younger, Caesar's fiercest moral opponent, refused to live under his rule. In Utica, he calmly read philosophy, dined with friends, and then took his own life. For many Romans, Cato's death was a symbol of republican virtue, the last stand of principle against Caesar's rise. For Caesar, it was a loss of a worthy enemy. He reportedly said, with some bitterness, "Cato, I begrudge you your death, for you begrudged me the chance to spare your life." With Africa subdued, Caesar returned to Rome in triumph. He celebrated lavish processions. Gauls, Egyptians, and Africans marched as captives. Treasure glittered in endless parades. Elephants and exotic animals dazzled the crowds. He enacted reforms, laws to settle veterans, reorganize debt, and expand citizenship. He also began centralizing power more openly. The Senate, once the heart of the Republic, now served largely at his command. Yet even as he basked in victory, unrest smoldered. Pompey's sons still resisted in Spain, and whispers of monarchy spread through Rome. For the moment, Caesar stood unrivaled. He had defeated Pompey, crushed the remnants of opposition, and restored order to Rome. His clemency won him admirers. His brilliance made him feared. But absolute power, once tasted, demands more. Ahead lay Spain, dictatorship, and the fateful Ides of March. Egypt in the 1st century BCE was both ancient and fragile. Its pyramids had already stood for 2,000 years. Its temples echoed with prayers to gods older than Rome itself, and its Nile carried the lifeblood of grain that fed millions. Yet the kingdom was weak. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from Alexander the Great's generals, ruled a divided court. Brother fought sister, advisors schemed, and Rome's influence grew with each passing year. For Caesar, Egypt was more than a sideshow in his civil war. It was the key to Rome's grain supply, a jewel of wealth, and a land that could anchor his dominance in the east. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, the city was gripped by civil war. Ptolemy XIII, a boy king, ruled under the sway of his advisors. His sister Cleopatra VII had been forced into exile. But Cleopatra was no passive victim. Bold and resourceful, she sought an audience with Caesar. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into the royal palace, wrapped in a carpet or linen sack. Unrolled before Caesar, she appeared radiant and unafraid. Caesar, hardened by decades of war yet captivated by brilliance, saw in her not just beauty, but political genius. Cleopatra spoke Greek, Egyptian, and several other languages. She knew how to command attention, how to flatter, and how to calculate. Their meeting was the spark of an alliance that would change both their lives. For Cleopatra, Caesar was her pathway back to the throne. For Caesar, Cleopatra was the key to stability in Egypt. Their partnership was pragmatic, but it quickly became personal. They dined together in the palace, spoke late into the night, and shared ambitions that stretched from Rome to the Nile. Cleopatra offered him Egypt's wealth and loyalty. Caesar offered her restoration and survival. This alliance enraged Ptolemy's advisors, who feared losing control. Soon Alexandria erupted in revolt, and Caesar found himself not merely a guest but a combatant in Egypt's dynastic struggle. Streets turned into battlefields. Roman soldiers fought Egyptian forces among markets, harbors, and temples. Fire consumed ships in the harbor, and the smoke of war darkened Alexandria's skies. The conflict would drag on for months, trapping Caesar in a foreign city, outnumbered and under siege. Yet from this crucible of chaos, a bond between Caesar and Cleopatra would only grow stronger. When Caesar declared support for Cleopatra's claim, Ptolemy XIII's advisors reacted with fury. The boy king's forces surrounded the palace quarter, cutting Caesar off with only a few thousand Roman soldiers at his side. Alexandria became a war zone, streets filled with barricades, arrows flew from rooftops, and the harbor turned into a battlefield of fire and sails. Caesar's enemies hoped to starve him out, but he responded with engineering genius, constructing defenses, digging trenches, and fortifying every approach. At one point, Egyptian forces attacked the Roman-held harbor. Fire spread to ships and nearby buildings. Ancient writers suggest that part of the Library of Alexandria may have been damaged in the chaos, though the extent remains debated. For Romans and Egyptians alike, the city's treasures seemed to teeter on the edge of ruin. Caesar himself was not spared danger. In a fierce naval clash near the harbor, he was nearly surrounded. Rather than surrender, he leapt into the sea, swimming to safety while clutching important documents above the waves to keep them dry. His soldiers, inspired by his daring, fought on with renewed determination. For months, the struggle dragged on. Caesar's position was precarious, far from home, outnumbered, and reliant on uncertain allies. Yet he never lost confidence. He wrote to Rome presenting the conflict, not as desperation, but as a calculated effort to secure Egypt, always shaping the narrative in his favor. In early 47 BCE, relief finally came. Forces loyal to Caesar, including allies from Asia Minor and Syria, marched into Egypt under the command of Mithridates of Pergamon. With these reinforcements, Caesar broke the siege and turned the tide. At the Battle of the Nile, Caesar's army decisively defeated Ptolemy XIII. In the chaos of retreat, the boy king drowned in the river. Cleopatra, with Caesar's backing, was restored to the throne. Cleopatra now ruled as queen, nominally alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, though she was the true authority. Her survival was owed to Caesar, but her ambition extended beyond gratitude. Together they sailed the Nile on a grand procession, blending politics with spectacle. Cleopatra presented herself not only as a monarch, but as the living goddess Isis, entwining her image with divine power. Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul and Rome's new master, played the role of her Roman counterpart. It was more than romance, it was political theatre, designed to solidify Cleopatra's reign and Caesar's prestige in the east. In the plains of Thessaly, near the town of Phaselis, the two armies at last faced each other. Pompey commanded nearly twice as many soldiers, supported by cavalry from the east. Caesar's army was smaller, but hardened by years of war in Gaul, and bound to him by unbreakable loyalty. The outcome would decide not only who ruled Rome, but whether the Republic itself would endure or be transformed forever. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV, Philopator Caesar, but he became known simply as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra proclaimed him Caesar's child, heir both to Egypt's throne and potentially to Caesar himself. Though Rome never formally recognized Caesarion, Cleopatra made sure his identity was tied to his father's glory. For her, Caesarion was more than a child. He was a symbol, proof that the blood of Rome and Egypt had mingled. For Caesar, his response was more ambiguous. He never openly acknowledged the boy in Roman records, yet he treated Cleopatra with honor and allowed her to visit him in Rome later, bringing Caesarion with her. News of Caesar's closeness to Cleopatra scandalized many Romans. Whispers spread that he had gone native, bewitched by an Eastern queen. Conservatives sneered that he had traded Roman discipline for luxury, that he dreamed of monarchy with Cleopatra at his side. Cato and Cicero mocked him openly, warning that the Republic could not endure such decadence. Even allies raised eyebrows. After all, Caesar already had a wife in Rome, Calpurnia, though marriages among Roman nobles were often more political than personal. But Caesar was unmoved by criticism. He knew appearances mattered, and he balanced his relationship with Cleopatra carefully. He emphasized her role as a loyal client queen rather than a rival ruler, presenting their bond as pragmatic rather than dangerous. By securing Cleopatra's throne, Caesar had done more than indulge in romance. He had drawn Egypt firmly into Rome's sphere. Its grain now flowed reliably to Roman markets. Its ships sailed under Caesar's influence, and its queen ruled with gratitude to him. Cleopatra's presence at his side symbolized something greater. Caesar was no longer just a Roman general. He was becoming a figure whose power stretched beyond the Republic, touching foreign thrones and ancient kingdom. In 46 BCE, after Caesar's victories in Africa, Cleopatra traveled to Rome with her young son Caesarion. She was housed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, not far from the city center. For Romans, her presence was electrifying and scandalous. A foreign queen, parading through Rome with her child, rumored to be Caesar's son, challenged the sensibilities of the Republic. To conservatives, it was proof that Caesar dreamed of monarchy. They whispered that he would make Cleopatra his queen and Rome an Eastern court. Yet many were fascinated. Cleopatra dazzled with her intelligence, charm, and regal bearing. She represented both the exotic East and the might of Caesar, who alone had brought her to Rome's doorstep. Cleopatra's visit brought more than scandal. It brought culture. Roman elites were exposed more directly to Egyptian science, medicine, and religion. Philosophers and scholars mingled with her entourage. Luxuries from Alexandria, perfumes, silks, papyrus, circulated in greater numbers. But alongside this cultural blending came fear. Romans prided themselves on their stern, austere traditions. Cleopatra, with her divine imagery and sumptuous lifestyle, seemed to embody the opposite. The idea that Caesar might be swayed by her unsettled many. Caesar, always pragmatic, kept the balance carefully. He honored Cleopatra but never gave her official recognition as his consort. He displayed Caesarion only discreetly, never naming him heir in Roman law. Yet by keeping her close, he ensured Egypt's loyalty and secured Rome's vital grain supply. Still, the optics were dangerous. Senators already feared his growing power. Every triumph, every reform, and every gesture of grandeur seemed to edge him closer to kingship. Cleopatra's presence only fueled suspicion. In 44 BCE, when Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, Cleopatra was still in Rome. She fled swiftly after his death, returning to Egypt with Caesarion. For her, Caesar's murder was both a personal and political disaster, but their relationship had already left its mark. Cleopatra's son would be seen by some as Caesar's blood, a living reminder of the union between Rome and Egypt. For Caesar himself, the bond with Cleopatra symbolized his reach beyond the Republic, a reach so vast that it unsettled his enemies into striking him down. By 46 BCE, Caesar had crushed his enemies in Africa. He returned to Rome in triumph, parading elephants, captives, and treasure through the streets. Yet victory brought more than glory. It brought responsibility. The Republic was broken. Civil war had emptied the treasury, disrupted trade, and shaken faith in institutions. Veterans demanded land, creditors demanded repayment, and ordinary citizens demanded stability. Caesar, now dictator, stepped into the role of reformer. Unlike Sulla, who had ruled with purges and terror, Caesar promised clemency and reconstruction. His dictatorship was not meant only for punishment, but for transformation. Caesar understood that reconciliation was more useful than revenge. Former enemies, even senators who had sided with Pompey, were invited back into public life. He pardoned many who had fought against him, hoping to turn foes into allies. This policy of clementia mercy shocked Romans used to the prescriptions of Sulla. To some it seemed noble, to others dangerously naive. Critics whispered that Caesar spared men who would one day conspire against him. They were not wrong. Yet clemency won him admiration among the people and softened the bitterness of civil war. It also enhanced his image as a magnanimous leader, above petty vengeance. One of Caesar's most lasting legacies was the calendar. The old Roman lunar system was chaotic, riddled with political manipulation by priests who inserted or removed months to favor allies. By Caesar's time, the seasons no longer matched the dates. Farmers and festivals alike were confused. With the help of Egyptian astronomers, knowledge perhaps influenced by his time with Cleopatra, Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 46 BCE. It fixed the year at 365 days, with a leap year every fourth year. Though refined centuries later, the Julian calendar remained the basis of Europe's reckoning of time for nearly 1600 years. Even today, echoes of Caesar's reform mark our months and years. Caesar also broadened the scope of Roman citizenship. Traditionally guarded by elites, citizenship brought privileges of law, property, and identity. Caesar extended it to communities in Gaul, Spain, and beyond, integrating them into Rome's political fabric. This policy strengthened loyalty to him personally, but it also reshaped the Republic into something more like an empire, a state not confined to Italy, but embracing diverse peoples across the Mediterranean. To traditionalists, this was dangerous dilution. To Caesar, it was foresight, binding the provinces to Rome and ensuring their allegiance for generations. The civil wars had left Rome's economy in shambles. Farms lay abandoned, trade routes disrupted, and the treasury drained. Inflation plagued the markets, and debt crushed many citizens. Veterans, who had followed Caesar loyally through Gaul and civil war, demanded the rewards they had been promised, land and security. Caesar faced the delicate task of restoring stability without alienating creditors, landowners, or the common people. Unlike Sulla, who had brutally confiscated property, Caesar sought solutions that balanced mercy with necessity. One of his most pressing issues was the settlement of veterans. Thousands of soldiers had followed him for years, and their loyalty was the foundation of his power. To neglect them would be dangerous. To reward them recklessly could destabilize society. Caesar established colonies not only in Italy, but across the provinces, in Gaul, Spain, Africa, and even Greece. By doing so, he avoided displacing too many Italians while also spreading Roman culture abroad. These colonies became miniature Romes, cities laid out with forums, temples, and roads, binding distant lands closer to the Republic. For the veterans, it was both reward and a chance to build new lives. Debt was another burning issue. Years of war had left many citizens unable to repay loans. Radical populares demanded cancellation of all debts, a measure that would devastate Rome's economy. The Optimates, meanwhile, insisted on strict repayment, which would ruin countless families. Caesar sought compromise. He forbade total cancellation, but he reduced interest, allowed payments to be made in property rather than coin, and stabilized property values to prevent creditors from seizing land unfairly. The result pleased neither extremists nor hardliners, but it restored order and confidence. Creditors were repaid at least partially, and debtors gained relief without destroying the financial system. The Roman urban population depended heavily on the grain dole, the state's distribution of free or subsidized grain. Over time, this system had swelled to hundreds of thousands, draining the treasury and fueling corruption. Caesar reformed the rolls, reducing the number of recipients to those truly in need. He also reorganized grain supply routes, ensuring that Rome would not face shortages. By balancing compassion with efficiency, Caesar secured the loyalty of the poor while curbing excess. Caesar also launched vast public works. He planned new forums, temples, and basilicas in Rome, not only to glorify his name but to provide employment. Roads were expanded, harbors improved, and drainage systems constructed. One of his most ambitious visions was a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, linking the Aegean to the Ionian Sea, a project centuries ahead of its time. Though unrealized, it revealed the scale of Caesar's imagination. The Roman Senate, once the guardian of tradition, had been diminished by years of civil war. Many senators had died at Pharsalus, Thapsus, and Munda, or fled into exile. Caesar saw both a problem and an opportunity. He expanded the Senate from about 600 members to nearly 900. New men from Italy, Gaul, and the provinces were admitted. Some were loyal veterans, others equestrian businessmen, and many were provincials whose families had only recently gained Roman citizenship. To conservatives, this was an outrage. They sneered at barbarians in the Senate, men who spoke Latin with accents and lacked ancient pedigrees. To Caesar, it was a way to dilute opposition, reward loyalty, and integrate the wider empire into Rome's governing class. Traditionally, Roman power was fragmented. Magistrates shared authority, elections limited terms, and the Senate guided policy. Caesar reshaped this system into something more centralized. He controlled elections, ensuring that consuls and praetors loyal to him held office. He took the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, in 44 BCE, breaking with the tradition that dictators ruled only in emergencies and for limited terms. He removed many procedural obstacles, streamlining governance but also weakening checks on his authority. This concentration of power alarmed his enemies. To many, it seemed he was not merely a powerful man within the Republic but a king in all but name. Caesar also enacted laws aimed at strengthening Roman society. Family incentives, He offered rewards for marriage and childbearing, seeking to reverse Rome's declining birth rate among the elite. Luxury laws. He attempted to curb extravagant displays of wealth at banquets, though enforcement was inconsistent. Provincial justice. He cracked down on corruption by governors, introducing stricter oversight and penalties. Such reforms reflected his desire to be seen as a moral reformer, not just a conqueror. Yet they also highlighted his tendency to legislate from above, imposing order rather than fostering debate. Though Caesar rejected the title of King Rex, his behavior increasingly resembled monarchy. Statues of him were placed in temples alongside gods. His portrait appeared on coins, an honor no living Roman had claimed before. Festivals and honors multiplied, celebrating him as savior of the Republic. To many, these were signs of tyranny. To Caesar, they were symbols of stability and legitimacy. But in a republic founded on hatred of kings, the optics were perilous. Caesar was not content with patching up the Republic. He envisioned something greater. His reforms were not only immediate solutions, but blueprints for an empire that stretched beyond Rome's traditional boundaries. He planned massive colonization projects, resettling veterans and the urban poor in Carthage, Corinth, and other great cities, reviving lands that had long lain in ruins. He spoke of draining the marshes of Italy, improving the Tiber's flooding, and building a vast library to rival that of Alexandria. He also dreamed of further conquests, campaigns against Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat at Carrhae, and expansion into the east to rival the glory of Alexander the Great. Whether these ambitions would have come to pass, history cannot say, but they reveal Caesar's mind, always reaching, never satisfied. In 44 BCE, Caesar accepted the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. To his supporters, this symbolized stability after years of chaos. To his enemies, it was proof of tyranny. The symbolism grew heavier. He wore the purple cloak of kings, sat on a golden throne at festivals, and allowed honors usually reserved for gods. Even if he never claimed the title of king, many believed he sought it. For a republic born from the expulsion of kings centuries earlier, this was intolerable. The Senate, though expanded and reshaped, still harbored resentment. Old families bristled at their loss of privilege. Senators pardoned by Caesar feared that mercy had made them complicit. Even some allies grew wary of his dominance. Whispers of conspiracy spread. Could the Republic survive if one man held all power? Or was Caesar leading Rome into monarchy, disguised as dictatorship? Among those who plotted were men Caesar had pardoned, men who had once fought against him and whom he had spared. His clemency, once his strength, had sown the seeds of betrayal. By early 44 BCE, Caesar stood at the height of his power. He had reformed Rome, expanded citizenship, secured grain supplies, settled veterans, and restored order. He was beloved by the masses, feared by the Senate, and envied by rivals. Yet the very scale of his success created the perception of danger. To some, he was Rome's savior. To others, he was its destroyer. The reforms that promised stability also concentrated power in his hands. And in a republic allergic to kingship, that concentration would soon prove fatal. By early 44 BCE, Caesar stood at the pinnacle of power. He had been named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. Statues of him rose in temples, his image appeared on coins, and honors usually reserved for gods adorned his name. To many Romans weary of war, this was stability at last, but to others, it was monarchy, in all but name. The Republic, founded on hatred of kings, could not bear even the shadow of one. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed Caesar intended to take the crown. At the Lupercalia festival, in February 44 BCE, Mark Antony publicly offered him a diadem. Caesar refused, not once but twice, and the crowd cheered. Yet the act planted seeds of suspicion. Why would Antony offer it, unless Caesar had hinted at such ambition? Why would Caesar refuse with such theatrical flourish, unless he wished to test public opinion? The Senate grew restless. Old families whispered that Caesar planned to make himself king, not of Rome, but of the provinces, ruling from Alexandria at Cleopatra's side. Whether true or not, the fear was real. Among those most alarmed were senators who owed their very lives to Caesar's clemency. He had pardoned many former Pompeians after Pharsalus and Thapsus, restoring them to office. Yet instead of gratitude, some felt shame. To live by the mercy of a dictator was, to them, dishonor worse than death. The conspiracy formed quietly. Leading it were Gaius Cassius Longinus, a bitter enemy of Caesar, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a man of nobler reputation. Brutus was especially troubling. He had been pardoned by Caesar, promoted, and even treated with affection. His ancestry traced back to Lucius Junius Brutus, the founder of the Republic, who had driven out Rome's last king centuries earlier. To the conspirators, Brutus's name was invaluable. If he joined them, they could claim not to be murderers but liberators, restoring the Republic. Ironically, it was Caesar's policy of mercy that doomed him. Had he executed his enemies as Sulla once had, no such conspiracy could have gathered. But by sparing them, he left alive men who despised his dominance. His refusal to install a bodyguard, preferring to appear fearless, left him exposed. He walked the streets with only a few attendants, confident in his popularity. To his enemies, this was an invitation. The plot began to take shape. Caesar must die, not on the battlefield, but in the heart of Rome itself. Through the winter of 44 BCE, conspirators gathered quietly in homes and porticos, whispering of liberty and vengeance. Men who had fought on opposite sides of the civil wars now sat together, united by fear of Caesar's power. Cassius fanned the flames of resentment. Brutus hesitated at first, torn between loyalty to Caesar and duty to the Republic, but Cassius pressed harder. Will you allow your name, descended from the founder of freedom, to become a shield for tyranny? Gradually, Brutus gave way. With him joined, the conspiracy gained legitimacy. To kill Caesar without Brutus would be seen as murder. With him it could be framed as restoration. By March, more than 60 senators had sworn to strike. In the days before the Ides, strange signs filled Rome. Sacrificial animals revealed ill omens. Birds circled ominously above the city. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of his statue bleeding as Romans washed their hands in the blood. She begged him not to attend the Senate on the 15th of March. For a moment he agreed, sending word that he would remain at home. But the conspirators panicked. Without Caesar's presence in the Senate, their plan would fail. Decimus Brutus, a trusted ally turned traitor, persuaded him otherwise. How will it appear if you dismiss the Senate for dreams? They will mock you as a man ruled by women and superstition. Reluctantly, Caesar agreed to go. In the days leading to the Ides, Caesar was both confident and weary. He spoke of campaigns against Parthia, of leaving Rome for new conquests. He also hinted at reforms unfinished, colonies to found, temples to raise, and new provinces to organize. Yet beneath his energy lay exhaustion. Years of war, endless responsibilities, and constant tension wore on him. Some ancient sources suggest he welcomed the idea of fate, as though sensing his end was near. On the morning of March 15, 44 BCE, he dressed in a purple toga, the garment of triumph, and prepared to walk to the Senate. The morning sun of March 15, 44 BCE, rose over Rome. Crowds filled the streets, some seeking audiences, others whispering of omens. Caesar, dressed in his purple toga of triumph, made his way toward the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was to meet. Irony hung heavy in the air. The Senate no longer gathered in the Curia, but in a hall attached to Pompey's theatre, the very man Caesar had defeated, whose shadow still lingered. As he entered, senators rose in respect. Yet among them were more than 60 men who had sworn his death. At first, the session began as usual. Senators presented petitions, crowding around Caesar as he took his seat on the gilded chair. The conspirators pressed closer, surrounding him, under the guise of courtesy. One man, Lucius Tillius Cimber, presented a request on behalf of his exiled brother. Caesar refused. Cimber seized his toga, pulling it down from his shoulders, the signal. At once the knives were drawn. The first blow came from Casca, striking Caesar in the neck, though clumsily. Caesar turned, seizing Casca's arm, crying out, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Chaos erupted. Daggers flashed in every direction as senators, men Caesar had pardoned, men he had raised to office, stabbed at him. He tried to rise, but the press of bodies hemmed him in. According to some accounts, he fought fiercely at first, pushing away assailants. But as the blades fell again and again, he staggered. When he saw Brutus among the attackers, ancient writers say he uttered words that echoed through history. Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus. Whether he spoke them or not, the sight of Brutus broke his spirit. Covering his face with his toga, he collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, struck by 23 wounds. The Senate chamber fell into stunned silence. Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the victor of Phasaelis, the ruler of Rome, lay lifeless in a pool of blood. His killers, drenched and trembling, looked upon their work. Some felt triumph, others already felt fear. For though Caesar was dead, the people of Rome were yet to learn, and their reaction would shape the fate of the Republic. When the deed was done, the conspirators stood frozen. The Senate chamber was spattered with blood. Caesar's body lay at the foot of Pompey's statue. For a moment, silence hung, then panic erupted. Many senators fled in terror, fearing reprisals. The conspirators, swords still in hand, marched into the streets shouting, "Liberty! The Republic is free." But the people did not cheer. They stared in confusion and dread. News spread quickly. When Romans saw Caesar's body carried through the Forum, pierced with wounds, grief overcame fear. He was not only a general but a patron of the poor, a man who had given land, food and spectacle. To many he was their champion. At his funeral, Mark Antony delivered a fiery oration. Holding up Caesar's bloodied toga, he pointed to each rent and stab, naming the traitors. The crowd, inflamed with anger, rioted. They built a pyre in the Forum, burning Caesar's body amid shouts and tears, then turned upon the houses of the assassins. The conspirators who had imagined themselves saviors of the Republic were forced to flee. The Ides of March removed Caesar, but it did not restore the Republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into new civil wars. Antony, Octavian, Brutus, Cassius, and later others would all vie for power. In striking him down, the conspirators had hoped to save liberty. Instead, they unleashed chaos that would end with Rome no longer a republic but an empire. And so Caesar's death became not the end of his story, but the beginning of his legend, a life that, even in betrayal, shaped the destiny of the Western world. The death of Caesar on the Ides of March was meant to restore the Republic. Instead, it shattered it further. The conspirators, Brutus, Cassius and their allies, had imagined the people would welcome them as liberators. Instead, fear and grief filled the city. They fled to the Capitoline Hill, swords still red with blood, but the people did not rally. The Senate was paralyzed, caught between loyalty to tradition and terror of mob violence. In the days that followed, power passed not to the liberators but to Caesar's allies, Mark Antony, his right-hand man, and Octavian, his young heir. Both men would use Caesar's memory as a weapon, invoking his name to gather legions and legitimacy. At Caesar's funeral, Antony transformed grief into fury. Displaying Caesar's pierced toga, he recited each wound as if the garment itself spoke. This was Cassius's dagger, this was Brutus's. The crowd, moved to rage, rioted. They seized benches and timbers from the Forum, building a great pyre. Caesar's body burned in the heart of Rome, while the mob stormed the houses of the assassins. This moment marked the failure of the conspiracy. They had killed Caesar's body, but not his spirit. His memory became a rallying cry. In Caesar's will, a surprise lay hidden. His great-nephew Gaius Octavius was named as adopted son and heir, taking the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Barely 19 years old, Octavian seemed no threat to seasoned generals, yet he possessed caution, patience and ambition. Claiming Caesar's inheritance, he began to build his own following. For veterans and citizens alike, loyalty to Octavian meant loyalty to Caesar's legacy. In death, Caesar became larger than life. His image adorned statues and temples. His birthday was celebrated with festivals. He was declared a divus, a god by decree of the Senate. From then on, his name was no longer just a man's. Caesar became a title of power. Emperors would bear it for centuries, from Augustus to Nero to Hadrian. Even beyond Rome, rulers would echo it. The Kaisers of Germany, the Tsars of Russia. The man who fell beneath daggers on the Ides of March became immortal in name. Though Caesar fell to assassins' blades, many of his reforms outlived him. His Julian calendar, introduced only 2 years earlier, became the standard by which Rome, and eventually much of the world, measured time. His colonies for veterans flourished, spreading Roman culture deep into Spain, Gaul and North Africa. Even his policies of citizenship expansion and provincial integration continued. Rome was no longer an Italian city-state, but the nucleus of an empire. Caesar had set the course, and no one could turn it back. After the funeral, Mark Antony tried to seize control. As consul and Caesar's trusted general, he positioned himself as heir in spirit, if not in law. He rallied soldiers with promises of vengeance and invoked Caesar's memory at every turn. But Antony's ambition was blunt, his methods heavy-handed. He squandered goodwill by seizing property and intimidating rivals. Many senators who had feared Caesar now feared Antony more. Meanwhile, young Octavian moved with quiet determination. Though lacking Antony's charisma, he had Caesar's name and Caesar's inheritance. He courted veterans, promising them land and rewards. Slowly, legions began to rally, not to Antony, but to Caesar's adopted son. Octavian understood the power of symbolism. Where Antony thundered, Octavian presented himself as dutiful and modest, claiming only to defend his father's legacy. This contrast won him allies among both the people and cautious senators. Every speech, every campaign, every alliance in the years after 44 BCE revolved around Caesar's shadow. To oppose Antony or Octavian was to oppose Caesar's memory. To support them was to declare loyalty to the man who had conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, and reformed Rome. The conspirators Brutus, Cassius and their allies soon discovered that while they had killed Caesar, they had failed to kill Caesarism. After the Ides of March, Brutus and Cassius fled east, gathering armies in Macedonia and Asia Minor. They declared themselves defenders of the Republic, raising legions with the wealth of the provinces. In Rome, however, Antony and Octavian struck a fragile alliance. Along with Marcus Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE. Unlike the informal pact Caesar once shared with Pompey and Crassus, this alliance was official, sanctioned by law, and armed with near-dictatorial powers. Their mission: avenge Caesar. The triumvirs funded their war effort through terror. They revived the old weapon of proscriptions, lists of enemies whose property would be confiscated and whose lives were forfeit. Thousands died, including the great orator Cicero, who had spoken out against Antony. His severed head and hands were displayed in the Forum, a chilling reminder that clemency had died with Caesar. Rome had traded one dictator for three. In 42 BCE, the triumvirs marched east to confront Brutus and Cassius. At Philippi in Macedonia, the fate of the Republic was decided. Two massive battles were fought. In the first, Brutus defeated Octavian, but Cassius, believing all was lost, took his own life. Weeks later, in the second clash, Antony crushed Brutus's army. Brutus, seeing no escape, also fell on his sword. The leaders of Caesar's assassination were gone. With their deaths, the Republic's last defenders vanished, and the world Caesar had created took full form. Though the conspirators were defeated, peace did not follow. The triumvirs soon turned on each other. Lepidus faded into obscurity, leaving Antony and Octavian to contest Caesar's legacy. Antony allied with Cleopatra, Caesar's former queen, and ruled the east from Alexandria. Octavian held Italy and the west. Their conflict, a final echo of Caesar's union with Cleopatra, would end in the naval battle of Actium and the rise of a new order, the Empire. In 31 BCE, the struggle between Antony and Octavian reached its climax at Actium, a naval battle off the coast of Greece. Antony, allied with Cleopatra, commanded a grand fleet. Octavian, guided by the brilliant general Agrippa, commanded discipline and strategy. The battle turned into a rout. Cleopatra fled with her ships. Antony followed, and their forces collapsed. Within a year, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead, he by his own sword, she by the bite of an asp, according to legend. Octavian emerged as sole ruler. The Republic was no more. In its place stood the Roman Empire. Octavian styled himself not as a tyrant, but as the princeps, the first citizen. In 27 BCE, he accepted the title Augustus from the Senate. Yet the heart of his power lay in his adoption. He was Julius Caesar's son. Caesar had been declared a god by the Senate, and temples rose in his honor. Octavian became Divi Filius, the son of the divine. In name and authority, he was heir not only to Caesar's will but to his divinity. Thus, Caesar's death created the framework for empire. His heir used his memory as the foundation of legitimacy, transforming Rome forever. Caesar's legacy is vast and layered. Ron, military genius. His conquest of Gaul reshaped Europe, bringing France into Rome's sphere and pushing Rome's borders to the Atlantic. Political vision. His reforms turned Rome from an Italian republic into a Mediterranean empire. Personal style. His clemency and charisma won hearts, even as his ambition stirred fear. Immortality of name. His name Caesar became synonymous with power itself, echoed in Kaiser and Tsar. For centuries after, rulers measured themselves against him. For writers, he was both tyrant and hero. For the common people of Rome, he was the man who had given them land, bread, and spectacle. In life, Caesar was brilliant, flawed, ambitious, and human. In death, he became myth, the figure who ended the Republic and birthed the Empire. His fall on the Ides of March symbolized the fragility of liberty, but his legacy lived on in the empire that bore his name. From Augustus to Constantine, from Charlemagne to Napoleon, leaders would claim kinship with Caesar. 2,000 years later, his shadow still lingers, reminding us of the power and the peril of one man's ambition. History often moves, not with quiet steps, but with sudden thunderclaps. Julius Caesar's life was such a thunderclap. A man who rose from the crowded streets of Rome to conquer Gaul, cross the Rubicon, and seize power unmatched in the Republic. Yet in his fall, we glimpse the paradox of his story. He sought to save Rome from chaos, yet his dominance destroyed the Republic. He promised mercy, yet inspired fear. He gave Rome order, but at the price of liberty. His death on the Ides of March was meant to restore freedom, but instead it unleashed civil war. Out of the struggle emerged something new, an empire that bore his name, ruled by emperors who called themselves Caesar. More than 2,000 years later, his influence lingers. The calendar we follow, the words for rulers in faraway lands, Kaiser, Tsar, all echo his name. His life is studied as both inspiration and warning, of genius that reshapes the world, and of ambition that cannot be contained. The man died, but the myth endured. Caesar became more than a Roman, he became timeless, and so, as the centuries pass, his shadow stretches still across history, a reminder of the fragile line between republic and empire, freedom and tyranny, man and legend,